So let's solve these tasks here. The goal is to control this section with view, so within view app with a view instance, and then store some data in that view app, which we can output here, our name, here, our age, and then also here in those other places where we output some, at least a little bit more dynamic data, like our age plus 5 years. That is the goal. Now with that, let's get started. I already do have the view import here, and I import the app.js file. So in the app.js file, since we do import view globally, we can use that globally available view object and call create app on it, just as you learned it over the last lectures. This creates a view app. You could also say a view instance, and I will use these terms interchangeably. We can store this app in a variable or constant, and this app needs some configuration. It needs an object which we pass to create app where we configure this view instance. Now in there you learned we can add data and methods. We can also add more, which we'll learn throughout the course. And we're going to start with some data which, and this is really important, has to be a method. So a data property that holds a function. And this is just the shorthand form of writing this. And this data method should return the actual data object full of all the data this view app is aware of. In this case, since we plan on outputting a name and an age, I think it makes sense to store a name field in here, which in my case is Maximilian, and an age field, which in my case holds a value of 31. But of course, you can name these properties in this returned object however you want, because as I mentioned, whilst the property names in the object you pass to create app are not up to you, you have to use data and methods and so on here, because view will look for those keys. This object here, which you return in data, is a different thing. This really is your data, the data you want to have in this view app, and therefore you can have any key value pairs in there. In my case, name and age. And now we want to output that information in this section. But for that, one important step is missing. We need to control this section with our view app. Thus far, I'm creating the app, but I'm not connecting it to the section here. For that, we need to call the mount method on our app, and to mount, we pass a string with a CSS selector that uniquely selects the part of the HTML code we want to control. And therefore, typically, we use an ID. We give this section an ID, which we could name assignment, but the ID name is totally up to you. And then down there, we can use an ID selector with hashtag assignment. Now, as a little side note, you could use other CSS selectors, like class selectors as well, but this would always just select the first occurrence of this class, because every app can only be connected to one HTML element. That's why you typically use an ID, since IDs should be unique in HTML, and that makes total sense if you then, well, just want to control one element with that ID. So now our view app here, this app, is connected with the mount method to this section with this ID. Now inside of this section, we can use this special view syntax. For example, the interpolation syntax here. So here where we want to output our name, we can use double curly braces opening and closing. And between those curly braces, we can point at our data properties. So add properties of this object which we return in data. So in this case, for example, name. And here we can point at age. And just name it age. Not this age or this name, not data.age or anything like that, just name and age. And view will automatically look in this object you return in data. Now these were the first two tasks already. We're outputting the name and the age. The next task is to output our age plus 5 here. And for that, we got various options. Here's option number 1. Again, we need the double curly brace syntax. There aren't many alternatives to that. You could use VHTML, but we don't want to output raw HTML here, so double curly braces makes a lot of sense. But we have different approaches regarding how we calculate our h plus 5. We can simply do h plus 5 here. This will work because, as you learned, between those curly braces, but also when using vbind, you can execute simple JavaScript expressions like this one. So if I save that and reload, here we see the h plus 5, which in my case is 36. But there also is an alternative to that. We could also specify a method. And for that, we add this methods key to this config object we're passing to create app. So next to data, we have methods. And methods holds an object full of the methods, so full of the functions we want to call from inside our Vue app. And there we could add a calculateH method if we wanted to, and return this.h plus 5. Now here it's this.h to access this h, because as I also explained, Vue takes all the properties you have in this object here, which you return in data, and merges it behind the scenes into this Vue app object which it creates. It also merges all the methods into that object, by the way. And therefore, this in here refers to this magically created and managed object behind the scenes and has therefore access to all those merged properties like h. That's why this h will give us access to this h. And now that we have this method, instead of running this code here in the template, which we could do, but instead of doing that, we can also just run calculate h here, like this. And if I save that and reload, we get the same result, it's just a different approach. Now, which approach is better? Wait a bit, I'll come back to that in later lectures when we also learn about another alternative. Now, the next task is to output a random number here. And again, we basically have the same two options. We need double curly braces because we want to output something which is dynamically derived with help of Vue. But now we could do math random in here, save that and reload, and we would see a different random number every time we reload. But we can also, again, use a method to move that code out of our HTML code into our JavaScript code. We could name it calculate random, but the name is totally up to you. You can use any name you want. And then here return math random. And then here, instead of calling math.random, we could calculate random, save that, reload, and we also again get different random numbers. Now that was task number 4. Now in task number 5, it gets a bit more tricky. Now we want to search some image on Google image search, and output it here. And of course not by simply putting the URL in here, which we absolutely could, but instead by leveraging our Vue knowledge and by storing the image link here in our Vue data and then binding this source dynamically to our data. Now for that, I picked some random image and I'm going to store it in a new property in this data object, image URL. Again, this name is totally up to you. Now in there, I just stored the link in a string. And now I want to use that image URL property here to set the source of this image. Now you learned that you can't use double curly braces here. This will not work. If we try to do that, we'll not see anything. Instead, when you want to set the value of an attribute to a dynamic value, so to a Vue managed value, you need this special directive, this instruction Vue provides to you, the vbind directive. Then you need a colon, and after that the attribute, which should be configured with vbind, so which should be set with vbind. And then here you don't need the curly braces, but you simply now have the data property name or the method name you want to point at here. And if I now save that and reload, here's my image. Now you'll see the styling is a bit off. Looks like I forgot to give this some sizing before I picked it, but that does not matter too much. What matters here is that we see an image. We'll build more realistic and beautiful apps throughout the course, no worries. Now last but not least, we got an input field. And now the goal is not to listen to what the user enters, we're going to do that soon, but the goal is to pre-populate this input field with our name, with help of the value attribute. Now again, we can do this without Vue, of course. If I do this here and reload, I see my name down there. But the goal is not to do it like this, but to do it with Vue, so that later we can also leverage Vue in other ways and make this more dynamic. And we actually do have our name stored in a data property already. So therefore, again, we want to bind this value attribute to a value stored in our Vue app. And we can do this with, well, vbind. Vbind value with this syntax and now bind it to name, because name is the property name we're using for this property which holds my name. And now if I save that and reload, my name, which I do have managed in Vue, is output as a default here in this input field. And that is it for the moment. Now, of course, we still got missing features. For example, we can't really react to user input and anything like that. But that's something we'll focus on next.